Great. Excuse me. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to the committee for having me here to speak. Something that I think is highly relevant to the clinical utility analysis of compounded BHT is the availability of FDA-approved hormone replacement or hormone therapy, that's medically appropriate to treat patients. And both of my co-speakers here touched on some of that, but I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into sort of what's missing when a compounded drug does not go through the approval process, and why it's so important to consider FDA-approved drugs and that patients use FDA-approved drugs unless they're not medically appropriate. So I think my slides are coming up in a second. Do you have the clicker? Oh, is that this? Which one do you do? Oh, great. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on compounding, just to level set. I think a lot of this is familiar to most of the committee, so I won't spend too much time on it. But, at the outset, it's really important, for everyone to be aware that compounded drugs can serve a critical medical need for patients whose needs can't be met by FDA-approved drugs. Cynthia mentioned one of them. If an FDA-approved drug is in peanut oil and a patient has an allergy to peanuts, a patient may need a compounded drug without that allergen. Another example that we see is when a pediatric patient or an elderly patient, for example, can't swallow a tablet and needs a compounded drug in a liquid form. As I mentioned, and sort of the critical context for this is that compounded drugs don't go through an approval process before they're marketed, which means FDA doesn't review them for safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing quality ahead of marketing. And that goes for both outsourcing facilities under Section 503B and state licensed pharmacies, physicians, or federal facilities under Section 503A. There's no pre-market FDA review. I think as everyone is aware, unfortunately, compounded drugs made improperly or using ingredients or formulations and the like that have not been reviewed by FDA before marketing have led to serious adverse events, including deaths. Again, just a quick overview of the compounding provisions of the law. Any new drug that is introduced into interstate commerce has to go through an FDA approval process. Drugs have to comply with current good manufacturing practice requirements, labeled with adequate directions for use. But Congress carved out compounded drugs from those requirements provided that certain conditions are met in Section 503A, and that was enacted in 1997. If all of the conditions in Section 503A are met, a compounded drug can qualify for exemptions from FDA approval requirements, labeling with adequate directions for use, and current good manufacturing practice requirements. In Section 503B, created in the Drug Quality and Security Act in 2013, drugs compounded by outsourcing facilities in accordance with all of the conditions in Section 503B can qualify for exemptions from FDA approval, labeling with adequate directions for use, and the new drug supply chain requirements that were also added by the DQSA. But importantly, outsourcing facilities are subject to current good manufacturing practice requirements. It's important to note, though, that outsourcing facilities like 503A facilities do not undergo a pre-market FDA inspection before they start manufacturing. FDA inspects them on a risk-based schedule, usually after they begin compounding and distributing drugs. So compounders under Section 503A, as I mentioned, state licensed pharmacies, federal facilities, physicians, there's thousands of them. They generally don't register with us, so we typically don't know who most of them are unless perhaps there's a complaint or a pharmacy is otherwise brought to our attention or we have a history, and so we know of them. they are primarily overseen by the states, and the scrutiny that states sort of apply to pharmacies in their states really vary widely, largely because of different resources that states are able to allocate to inspections. Some states just have one or two inspectors for many pharmacies. Quality standards vary, although we're hoping with the United States Pharmacopoeia standards that are being sort of strengthened and clarified, there'll be more uniform adoption of United States Pharmacopoeia standards. And importantly, compounding physicians recognized in our Act are typically not routinely overseen by any regulatory body. And so we understand that the boards of medicine typically don't engage in any oversight of physicians who compound drugs. And state boards of pharmacy sometimes have some authority, but typically do not. Outsourcing facilities have to register with FDA. It's a voluntary decision to become an outsourcing facility, but once an entity does become an outsourcing facility, must register with us, has to compound sterile drugs, but can also compound non-sterile drugs, complies with all of the conditions of Section 503B, may or may not be a licensed pharmacy, but there has to be a pharmacist. And importantly, outsourcing facilities can do what's often called office stock, meaning that they can compound and distribute drugs without receiving prescriptions for individually identified patients and distribute them to healthcare facilities, hospitals, clinics, and the like. And that's really the primary incentive for a compounder to decide to become an outsourcing facility and subject itself to the increased, FDA oversight and quality standards. And that's important to keep in mind when considering the large-scale distribution of compounded BHT. It's not necessarily in response to an individual patient prescription from a prescriber, but could be, produced on a large scale and distributed to healthcare facilities nationwide. So I apologize, the slide's a little bit small. I didn't realize it was going to look that small on the screen, but I'll talk through it. So I'm going to go over at a very high level some of the regulatory requirements for FDA approval, and then contrast it with what we expect or what's required for compounded drugs. So as an initial matter, under our Act, Section 510, manufacturers, packers, and distributors have to register their facilities with FDA and list their drugs with FDA, so we know who they are. And we use that information to create our risk-based inspection schedules for these entities. Their products undergo pre-market review for safety, effectiveness, and quality. And so we look at, they submit, of course, an application to FDA with data, and we review that application to assess whether the drug is indeed safe and effective for its proposed indications, and that the benefits of the drugs outweigh the risks. Of course, all drugs have risks, and it's really, in part, a balancing. And for generic drugs, of course, we look to see if the product is, among other things, bioequivalent to the reference listed, NDA drug. We review labeling to ensure, for example, there are adequate warnings, directions for use, and this is adequate directions for use, and this is something that I think both of my co-speakers alluded to. In addition to these, any sort of claims made on the labeling is something that we review. They're manufactured in a facility that undergoes pre-market assessment, and often that's including a site inspection, and will determine during that inspection whether essentially CGMP is met based on any operations that we can review before the facility actually starts operating. In particular, we'll look at the facilities and the procedures, and that's something that often when we inspect compounders, we find after the fact that they've been producing drugs and using facilities that are not conducive to maintaining the sterility of a drug product. And so this is something that we look at with conventional manufacturers prior to their beginning manufacturing. Importantly, we also look at the bulk drug substance, or the API that's going to be used to produce the FDA-approved drug, and that may involve inspection of the manufacturer of the bulk drug substance, which has to be identified in the application. And there's a number of, information that we look at there, including the specifications for purity, potency, and other attributes of the bulk drug substance in the context of the drug product that's going to be manufactured under the approved application. So there might be a certain level of impurities that's acceptable in, for example, an oral drug product and not an injectable drug product. After the pre-market review process and we approve a drug, these conventional manufacturers undergo routine post-market inspections on a risk-based schedule, and that's something that 503A pharmacies typically do not. And it's also important that they are subject to specific adverse event reporting requirements, as well as field alert reporting requirements, which concern potential product quality issues that have to be reported to us within 3 days, business days. So to contrast that, for compounded drugs, as I mentioned, there's no pre-market inspection requirement before the compounder can begin producing and distributing drugs. And I'll emphasize again, that's for both 503A facilities and 503B outsourcing facilities. There's no pre-market review of the bulk drug substances that are used in compounding, no pre-market site inspection of the manufacturer of the bulk drug substance. With respect to 503A facilities, there's typically no post-market inspection of 503A facilities, and as I noted, we do a small number of surveillance inspections of 503A facilities, of which we are aware. We'll also do for-cause inspections if we receive some sort of complaint, adverse event, product quality issue, and we'll do follow-up inspections after initiating a regulatory action or issuing a warning letter, for example, or seeking an injunction. But there are thousands out there, and we don't know who most of them are. 503A compounders typically don't report adverse events to FDA. We often find out about them through voluntary reporting mechanisms, such as from prescribers or patients, but we suspect that there is, significant underreporting. There's a voluntary mechanism, and the 503A facilities don't report to us typically. So here are some concerns about lack of pre-market review, and I'm going to actually go over these and then provide some concrete examples to help illustrate this point. And I'll say before I begin discussing this slide, there's been a lot of attention, and rightfully so, to the significant quality concerns associated with many compounded drugs that have led to, outbreaks and other serious adverse events. Obviously, most notably, the 2012 fungal meningitis outbreak that led to more than 60 deaths and more than 750 cases of serious infection. Many patients are still recovering, and there continue to be deaths. There's a long history of outbreaks and product quality issues both before that event and since then. And so it's extremely important that we focus on quality issues associated with compounded drugs. However, what I think sometimes gets less attention that's equally important is safety risks associated with the lack of pre-market review. And so the examples that I'm going to give here illustrate that too can lead to serious adverse events and deaths. And I hope that helps sort of explain why it's so important that when we're reviewing clinical utility, we look at, Cynthia showed that there might be even a parity pretty soon between the use of compounded BHT and the use of FDA-approved hormone therapy products. And I wonder whether patients who are using the hormone therapy products, the BHT, have a medical need for it that can't be met by the approved drug. And so when considering that, here's some risks to keep in mind associated with the use of any drug that hasn't gone through a pre-market review process. So unknown safety and efficacy profile of an active ingredient that is not a component of FDA-approved drug. To give an example, and these are all what we call risk alerts on FDA's website. So they're available publicly. But to give one example of that, we recently issued a compounding risk alert associated or warning patients and providers about the drug products containing the substance cesium chloride. patients were taking cesium chloride compounded product to try to treat cancer. And, our review identified, QT prolongation, other serious cardiac events, deaths, and the list goes on. And so that's a compounded drug product that was not studied by FDA before it was marketed, and we found that the active ingredient contained significant safety concerns. Unknown safety and efficacy profile of a compounded drug product with attributes from that differ from the approved drug product. So there might be drug products that contain the same active ingredient as an FDA-approved drug product, but when you're looking at the compounded formulation, it might differ significantly from what is FDA-approved. Unknown safety profile of inactive ingredients in a particular compounded formulation. A very recent example of this is recently, last year, I believe, 43 patients experienced significant vision impairment. Many experienced permanent vision loss after receiving an intravitreal injection of a compounded drug product that contained 3 different active ingredients, and it contained the excipient poloxamer at 12%, and any FDA-approved topical ophthalmic drug products contained 0.1 to 0.2% poloxamer, so it's significantly higher than an FDA-approved drug. And no FDA-approved drugs for intravitreal injection contained that poloxamer. So that's an example of a safety issue that we would have reviewed in an application to assess the safety of the formulation, including the inactive ingredients in that formulation. The quality of a bulk drug substance using compounding may not be appropriate for the drug product produced. I didn't bring this one, but there was an issue with excess endotoxins in a bulk drug substance recently that perhaps may have been appropriate to produce an oral formulation, but instead was used for injection, and there were adverse events that may have been associated with the excess endotoxins in the bulk drug substance that was used. And then this is something that there's been a lot of focus on so far today. The labeling of an approved drug product may omit warnings relevant to its use. And an example of this risk is in 2017, 2 patients who received infusions of curcumin, which is a component of turmeric, experienced hypersensitivity reactions. One of them died, and it turned out that the curcumin product contained the excipient polyethylene glycol 40 or PEG 40 castor oil, and FDA-approved drug products containing that excipient typically have a black box warning for hypersensitivity reactions, and there was no warning on the labeling, and perhaps if there had been, physicians would have assessed whether the drug was appropriate for patients and whether they had allergy to that ingredient. So those are just a few examples that illustrate not just issues with production standards post manufacturing, but also what's missing when there isn't FDA review. And there's more examples to ensure that the drug product, the excipients, the active ingredients, the labeling, the container, the whole product is safe and effective, and that its risks do not, or that its benefits outweigh its risks for patients. That's it. Oh, and one more slide. Sorry. So just in terms of highlighting again the value of the research that's going on, we think it's extremely important, and we want the committee to know that it will inform FDA's work on compounding, the information that you provide to us, including the active ingredients that outsourcing facilities can use in compounding. We have to develop a list of which active ingredients outsourcing facilities can use in compounding, and of course, hormones are a candidate for that list. And we hope too that the information that will be visible to the public, both during these sessions that are open to the public, as well as the product of the committee's work will help make prescribers and others aware. Cynthia mentioned a lot of people just don't realize that these drugs are not FDA approved, and so I think increased visibility in this space will be helpful, as well as professional societies and even other federal agencies that either reimburse or compound or administer these types of drugs. Thank you very much.